Good evening and welcome to tonight's lockdown learning conversation. My name is Bren Carlil and I am the Director of Public Affairs at the Zionist Federation of Australia. Tonight we are here to discuss the remnant of the Jewish community in Ethiopia. We're going to talk about the obstacles that they face living there as well as the obstacles that they are facing in making Aliyah. After that, we're going to turn our conversation to the Ethiopian community in Israel, and their story has been one of both successes but also challenges that are still to overcome. Before I introduce my guests, I want to give you a quick reminder about next week. I will have the pleasure of speaking to Moshe Ya'alon, who is the former defense minister, as well as the IDF chief of staff who won the Second Intifada for Israel. He was also a member of the leadership team of the Blue-White Coalition, but due to the vagaries of Israeli coalition politics, now finds himself in opposition in the Knesset. And now to our guests. Dr. David Breakstone serves as the Deputy Chair of the Executive of the Jewish Agency for Israel and as a member of the executives of the World Zionist Organization, the Jewish National Fund, and Keren HaYesod. He previously served as the Vice Chair of the World Zionist Organization and was the conceptual architect and founding director of its Herzl Museum and Educational Center. In his spare time, David is a volunteer member of the directorates of Yad Vashem, the Ethiopian National Project, the Schechter Institute, and the Nativ Center for Jewish Identity and Conversion. David was born in the United States but has lived in Israel since the 1970s. His PhD focused on teaching Israel in the diaspora, and his academic pursuits since that time have focused on Jewish education and identity. David will be speaking with Rebecca Lacey-Ehrlich this evening. She is the Honorary Secretary of the Zionist Federation of Australia and Vice President of the Zionist Council of New South Wales. She holds an arts law degree and practiced as a solicitor before going on to complete her Masters in Jewish, Hebrew, and Biblical Studies at Sydney University. In 2008, Rebecca and her husband Simon established a project in Israel to assist Ethiopian Jewish families with a focus on mentorship and empowerment through education. Over the past 12 years, Rebecca, her husband, and their two children have developed strong personal relationships with various members of these families, providing them with a first-hand understanding of the many challenges the Ethiopian community in Israel face. So without further ado, Rebecca, I will hand the conversation over to you.
Well, thank you, Bren, and thank you, David, for joining us this evening. We are really excited to have you here tonight to discuss this very important topic. Most of tonight's conversation will be focused on the predicament of those remnants of the Ethiopian Jewish community that have been left behind in Ethiopia and are desperate to make Aliyah. But before we start that discussion, to put everything into some sort of context, David, can you give us a very brief little refresher course about the history of the Jews of Ethiopia and how they ended up in Ethiopia and the waves of their immigration into Israel?
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you for this opportunity and indeed labeling it as such an important subject. Unfortunately, not everybody in the Jewish world sees it that way. So I'm very thankful for this opportunity to share the situation of Ethiopian Jewry with you all. In terms of an overview of their situation and how they got to where they are, many people think this is a very recent issue, just the last few decades or so. In fact, it's a matter that's gone back and that the Jewish world has been aware of for several hundred years already. I'm going to share the screen here so that, let's see, we got it up there. As I'm walking you through it, just to give you some reference points as to how long the matter of Ethiopian Jewry has been on the agenda one way or another of the Jewish community. It goes all the way back, well, we'll start with the 16th century, although it goes back even further, when the first modern, so to speak, responsa came out, indicating that indeed those in Ethiopia who claim Jewish ancestry were confirmed as being of the tribe of Dan that had made its way one way or another from the land of Israel into Africa. That was confirmed by a very prominent rabbi a couple of hundred years later, who not only confirmed his recognition of the community, but really called upon the Jewish world to reconnect. We'll skip another century or so till Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, the chief rabbi of Israel at the time, who confirmed the Jewish ancestry of these people, a decision that he made that was affirmed just a couple of years later by the Ashkenazi chief rabbi Goren. And following the decision of the chief rabbis of Israel, Menachem Begin already began a covert operation of bringing over Ethiopian Jews almost 45 years or so ago. Then, of course, there was the first major operation of airlifting 8,000 over in what's become known as Operation Moses from Sudan. We've all heard the stories of those who made their way from Ethiopia under the most dangerous and difficult conditions to Sudan. A full 4,000 or so dying en route. A tremendous loss to the Jewish world as a whole, not just to the Ethiopian Jewish community. I won't go into the politics of what was going on in Ethiopia and Sudan and so on at the time, but those of you who have Netflix can check out the movie The Red Sea Diving Resort, which is a full-length feature film that was made on that daring rescue of those 8,000 who were airlifted from Sudan. That was followed 7 years later by Operation Solomon. And in 36 hours, and I want to emphasize that, there was in 36 hours, over 14,000 members of the Ethiopian Jewish community were brought to Israel. Since then, there's been several government decisions that would allow additional members of the community to come. 70,000 were brought by the year 2013. At that point, somehow, it's still unclear to me and to those involved with this issue exactly how it came about. But the government of Israel declared the mission accomplished, that they've all been brought over, somehow ignoring the more than 9,000 members of the community who were still left in Addis Ababa and in Gonda. As a result of public pressure and efforts of those who were concerned about those, the government decided in 2015 to bring over all those who remained, who had relatives already in Israel, and decided that, and in that government decision, it was said that by the year 2020, by the end of 2020, they would all be here. We're now 6 months away from that target date, and we still have thousands who are left there. What's happened in the next 5 years, perhaps we'll leave that for the end of this discussion, but that brings us really up to where we are at the moment, more or less.
Thanks, Dave. Now, a year and a half ago, you went to visit the remnant Jewish communities in Ethiopia. Can you describe what you saw there?
Yeah, first of all, I'll mention that my visiting there was to put the matter of Ethiopian Jewry back on the agenda of the Jewish Agency. We had closed down our operations in Ethiopia back in 2013 when the government said that all those who needed to be brought over had been, but there was concern, I had concern and shared by others, that there was still work to be done. And it was at that point that our chairman, Isaac Bougie Herzog, indeed asked me to go over and take a look at what was there. I really didn't know what to expect. And I think I was most overwhelmed by what I discovered to be an incredible and passionate devotion to Jewish life and Jewish tradition on the part of those who were there. And I'm going to illustrate this again with some photos here. I'll just run through some of them as I speak, if I can get this to work. This is in the synagogue appropriately called Hatikva in Gonda. It's a dirt floor and tin roof synagogue, but it's really the center of the community life. They pray there 3 times a day, and they end every service with the singing of both Am Yisrael Chai and Hatikva. 3 times a day they end their service that way. I will tell you, I've heard Hatikva sung many times in my life, and perhaps I'm a bit jaded, but never did I feel the meaning of those words of hope more strongly than when I saw this congregation singing them. This is the mikveh that they have there that's operating, and the mikveh keeper. They've got one fully functional in the community. Young people studying. This is on a Friday afternoon just before Kabbalat Shabbat, of young people, young and studying and singing, and they come together for a pre-Shabbat gathering every week, all the ages together. There's an afternoon school, a supplementary Jewish school that's run for the children. You can see, I don't know, to me, they're particularly eager here to participate. We got a lecture from a 9-year-old, the whole story of Rabbi Akiva came and spoke to us, things that I don't know how many Israeli children, never mind Jewish children elsewhere, could have given the impromptu lecture he gave us on Rabbi Akiva, and so on. So I bring all those things up in terms of, and I have many more pictures that I could share with you and so on, but their commitment to Jewish life is really amazing. That being said, the way they live is, for me, it was unimaginable. This is a typical street in Gonda where people live. You can see, when they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, I think this is one of them that certainly is worth 1,000 words. On the left-hand side, you can see the entrance into one of the one-room homes, hovels that people live in. This is a better look inside. It's not uncommon for a family of 6 or even 8 to sleep in one small bedroom with mattresses spread out across the floor. The mattresses are stacked up during the day. At night, they're spread out, and that's what people sleep on. Again, dirt floors, no running water. Some of them have generators for electricity. The vast majority do not. No kitchens. They share a communal fireplace where they, if they want to, you get up and you want a cup of coffee in the morning, they have to light the fire and start from scratch. Here it is. This is actually the communal kitchen for that area. You can see the fire pit that's there. There is a nutrition program that has been sponsored by something called the Struggle to Save Ethiopian Jewry. There's terrible malnutrition rampant in the community. And this is a nutrition program that allows pregnant and nursing mothers and seriously malnourished children up to the age of 5 to get a breakfast in the morning that consists of a banana, a potato, an egg, and a roll. And that's wait 1 second, let me just go back here. So those are some of the indications, some of the illustrations of the terrible poverty that they are living in. Most of them, nobody almost has any kind of regular work. There are day laborers that for various construction jobs or agricultural work, they'll be picked up for the day. I asked them, how are they surviving? How are they living? And the answer, I never in a million years would have expected it. They said they're living with donations, contributions that they get from their families in Israel. And Rebecca, I know you're the last one who needs to be told how poor the people are in Israel. It turns out the vast majority of those waiting in Gondar are sustained by contributions that their families here are able, one way or another, to send them. So that's some of what I saw. I don't know if you wanted me to go into any more detail about any of that.
You can really see from those photos, the really deep connection that these people have to their Jewish heritage and how much it means to them. And it's quite an interesting. The community is quite interesting in that the Jewish community that currently remain in Ethiopia are known as the Falashmura. Can you explain what is the difference between the Falashmura and the Beta Israel Ethiopian Jewish communities? Because as far as what I understand is the Beta Israel have a right of return to Israel under Jewish law, whereas these people, the Falashmura, they don't have that right of return. I think this is what's created a lot of the present issues with the remnants in Israel. So if you can explain how this all works.
Okay, so of course, according to Jewish law, one's Jewishness, one's being Jewish is determined by birth to a Jewish mother. It gets very complicated because there's a difference between what the halakha says and what the law of return says. In any case, all those who were brought over were required to go through a conversion process here in Israel to get rid of any doubt as to whether or not they were indeed Jewish according to the halakha. The Ethiopian Jewish community, it's fascinating, but apparently they, by oral tradition, are able to trace their roots back 7 generations. And the Kesim, the spiritual leaders, the rabbis, so to speak, of the community, have these records that go back 7 generations, in part because no intermarriage is allowed between family members for 7 generations back. I'm not sure exactly how far what the relationship is required or not required to allow a marriage to take place, but they do have these records of it. And those who came over from Beit Yisrael indeed were able to trace their matrilineal descent back several generations, which indeed allowed them to be brought over in the first the tens of thousands that originally came. But as I said, in order to ensure that there was no doubt, they did have to go through a conversion process here, a limited conversion process, but nevertheless, they did have to go through it. What turns out, however, is that there are many thousands who are either married into the community or who have patrilineal descent. And whereas Jewish law does not recognize one as being fully Jewish through patrilineal descent, there is a halachic concept of Zera Yisrael, of the seed of Israel. And those who are of the seed of Israel, even if it's not on the matrilineal descent, are among those who are in the Falashmura. There's also the distinction to be made of, or the difficulty that arises because the many generations ago had converted to Christianity. And there are issues, particularly regarding the law of return. If one converted, if one is descended from people who converted, are they eligible for aliyah? And then they get into the question of, is it conversion under duress or conversion of free choice? In any case, all of those whose Jewish status was questionable, but nevertheless were connected to the community, fall into that category of Falashmura. And they have been allowed in, and the government decisions from 2015 on are allowing them in not under the law of return, but under the law of entry. And the conditions that were originally set up were that they had to have first-degree relatives in Israel, that they had to be members of the community, so to speak, registered within the official Jewish community registrar in Ethiopia, that they took it upon, were committed to go through a full conversion upon arrival in Israel, and a fourth stipulation that they had to have left their villages and been in Gondar or Addis Ababa waiting to make Aliyah since 2010. And that's where the numbers, the people who fit into that category numbered some 9,300 or so about 5 years ago. So that's the core of the community that has been stranded there.
Yeah, and what are the new restrictions? You just recently you said there are new restrictions. So they originally were going to let them all come to Israel gradually, and now there are new restrictions that are placed upon their married children and their grandchildren. Can you elaborate on that?
Right. There's a saying, I don't remember, I think it was attributed to Shamir when he was prime minister of Israel, but maybe it was somebody else. In any case, the politician is famously known to have said, I made a promise, but I didn't promise to keep my promise. That's part of what happened in 2015. The government made this decision to bring everybody over to start within 4 months and to complete the mission, as I said, by the end of 2020. But they didn't get around to creating a budget that would allow that aliyah to take place, and then started creating new restrictions as to who would be brought over when. And those new restrictions that went into effect were that, again, first-degree relatives, but if somebody had a child already in Israel or a parent already in Israel, they would be allowed to come and to bring unmarried children of their own with them, but their married children would have to remain behind, at least for the time being, which means also the grandchildren would be left behind. I'll show you a picture shortly of a woman who I met on that visit in January, who literally was crying to me. She pointed to 3 of her children who were going to be allowed to come with her, minors who were not married, and told me of 2 older daughters that she had who were married, who she was going to have to leave behind. And she had no choice. That was her choice. Either she had to stay there back in Ethiopia with her whole family, or be allowed to come and leave these children and their spouses and her grandchildren behind her. She made that choice. She actually came to Israel in, I think it was February or March of last year. I had the opportunity a couple of months later to meet her in her absorption center in Ashkelon. And I'll just point out, you saw I actually met her in one of those hovels that I showed you a picture of. She was living exactly in those conditions. I met her in her new sparkling clean apartment in the absorption center in Ashkelon. A 2-room apartment with running water, electricity, and so on and so forth, refrigerator, things that she had never had imagined having back there. And yet, despite this huge improvement in living conditions, again, she literally was crying to me, bring me my other daughters, bring me my other daughters. When are they going to be allowed to come?
So
and
David, yeah, I'm just saying, David, what is it? I mean, what's going on in Israel? I mean, why is the Israeli government doing this?
There are many who are afraid that opening the doors, there's a whole, despite the devotion to Jewish tradition and Jewish lifestyle that I've spoken about, there also has been a lot of intermarriage within the community. And there's concern that if it's not stopped at a certain point, that the children will start bringing over their extended families, relatives, that there'll be a never-ending spiral or chain of claims to come, since they're not being brought specifically as Jews or as members of the Jewish community, but on the basis of the law of entry is officially they're being brought on the basis of family reunification. There is concern that a firm line has to be drawn, or I will tell you, it's not nice to say it in these terms, but one of the people from the ministry, the population ministry, population registry here in Israel said, what, you want me to bring over half of Africa? That was his concern. I won't deny that there is some basis for concern that if it's only on the basis of family reunification, that it will be very hard to stop. There are others who have said as well that it's not just the Ethiopians, but who knows what would happen with the Palestinians and Arabs coming over on the basis of family reunification. There are people living in Israel proper who have relatives over the Green Line living in Arab states. And if we bring over all these Ethiopians, not on the basis of their being Jewish, but on the basis of family reunification, we will have opened the doors wide to claims to be able to come that no one will be able to close. We in the Jewish Agency have made it very clear in our policy paper that the criteria are twofold. It's not just family reunification, but indeed it's connection to the Jewish people. And it's once we say it's this connection to the Jewish people, it certainly puts limits on who would be allowed to come. But there are others. I will say as well that there are also those within, it's a very small minority and not particularly vocal, but in the interest of full transparency, I will mention it. There are those within the Ethiopian community here who are also opposed to bringing over the Falashmura. The contention being that that their parents or grandparents did convert to Christianity. They betrayed the Jewish people in that sense, and we are no longer responsible for them or beholden to them. So there's opposition from that as well. But I think it's very fair to say today that the overwhelming majority, not just within the Ethiopian community of a certainty, but overwhelming majority of Israeli society as a whole would indeed like to see all those who are still there, who fit within a broader category, would be allowed to come.
And what do you see as the solution to all of this? I mean, do you think that there is a solution? Do you think it will be resolved?
I'm hopeful, yes. Both of the party leaders who were opposing one another, but who are now together, both Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu, leading up to the 3 elections that we had this past year and a half or so, both had it as part of their platform to facilitate the arrival of the rest of the community. Just prior to the elections, and I won't comment on it, but Netanyahu did did proclaim that 400 more would be brought over this year. 143 or so, I think, have already come. And it's very important to note now as well that the new Minister of Aliyah, is herself of Ethiopian origin, somebody I've had the pleasure to work with sporadically over the last number of years. She's been very active within the Ethiopian community for years, and a deputy minister. So she's now in Benny Gantz's party and was given the Aliyah portfolio. And a colleague of hers, another member of Knesset, who's now been made a deputy minister from the Likud party, are both now in prominent positions. It's the first time that we've had a minister of Ethiopian origin or a deputy minister of Ethiopian origin. And that in and of itself says it's a statement. And it certainly means that within the government, there are those who are pushing now very hard for a resolution to the matter.
And what are the numbers, would you say, of the Falashmura that are remaining?
Okay, that's a trick question. Yeah, you know what? I'm going to go back for a minute to. One second, let's see if I can get this to work. Easier said than done. Okay, I'm going to go back to that first slide to follow up now from 2015, what's happened since. So in 2015, again, that decision was made that the 9,300 or so that were identified as still being in Addis and Gonda would be brought over to Israel. Nothing happened until 2017. It took 2 years, and the first 1,300 of those 9,300 arrived. At the end of 2018, it was decided to bring over up to an additional 1,000 in 2019. In fact, in 2019, only 602 were found to be eligible according to that new criteria that were established with the taking of that decision. And as I mentioned before, the pre-election promise brought over so far another 234 have already or will have been, well, have been brought so far. There are a total, just for your information, of 3,000 or so currently in our absorption centers that the Jewish Agency is operating here. If one adds up all those numbers, the 1,300 that came in 2017 and the 1,000 that came over in 2018, we should be down to about 7,000 people remaining there. And yet recently, numbers have been shared suggesting that there are still some 14,000 in Ethiopia awaiting Aliyah. There are different lists that exist now. The community has its lists. There was also a few years back, all of the Ethiopians in Israel were allowed to submit requests to bring over their relatives who were still in Ethiopia, again on the basis of family reunification. And those various those various lists now bring the number up to somewhere between, it's a huge difference, between 7,000 and 14,000. In trying to figure out where those additional several thousand came from, the answer primarily is that when the decision was made in 2015, as I mentioned, one of the stipulations was that it applied only to those who were in the centers of the community by 2010. And it turns out that several thousand have made their way now from other villages throughout Ethiopia to the communities. Some of the people, I should mention, have been waiting in Gonda and Addis Ababa, and I'm not exaggerating, for up to 20 years for various reasons. They've been waiting for 20 years. People in the villages were aware that not everybody was coming over, and were hesitant to leave their villages and join the community in Addis or Gonda because what's happened is that those who came to Addis and Ganda, who have been stuck waiting, are living in abject poverty, as was illustrated by some of the pictures that I showed you. Those in the countryside have little, they live through sustenance farming. They've got a little plot of land around them where they grow their own food or graze their own goats. Their houses, although still without electricity and running water, are not quite as squalid as the ones are in the city. So people were hesitant. But as the years passed and new promises were made, and the hope was reignited that they would also be able to eventually make their way to Israel, they wandered into the villages. And one of the things that the Jewish Agency is now lobbying to make happen is that these various lists will somehow be cross-referenced so that we'll be able to come up with an authoritative really listing of who is eligible and who's not. Others have been arguing, forget about the numbers. We don't need to talk about numbers. We need to talk about principles and criteria. And if it's 10,000, great. If it's 20,000, great. We don't limit the number of immigrants that we want from France or from the former Soviet Union or from Australia or any other country in the world. Why should we say that we're going to limit the numbers here? Let's establish the criteria by which people will be allowed to come. And as I said, for the Jewish Agency, that criteria is twofold. One, connection to the Jewish people, and two, family reunification. I'll also just mention, I've been talking about first degree relatives. It's true as well that in the original government decision, it said first degree relatives would come first. Then after that, second degree relatives would be considered. The latest government decisions knocked out the phrase about second degree relatives. So we have cases even with, well, I'll show you in some, okay, I'll leave that at the moment. So I think you asked about what the solution is. The solution really is establishing a, you know what, I'm gonna go back to share screen for a moment. You'll allow me. And now we'll go through these again. And here are people in waiting. I had meetings with them. This is a classic picture. This gentleman is showing me pictures here of his brothers and other family members who are already in Israel. He was waiting 12 years. I'm pleased to say that he actually just arrived in the country during the coronavirus. Prior to the elections, as I said, Netanyahu agreed to bring over another few hundred. He was one of them. But the story doesn't end there either. That's the good news. The bad news is he also has married relatives in Israel who don't, back in Ethiopia, who are not eligible to come under the new criteria. But showing pictures of people who are in waiting is classic. This one, the young man on the left here, and this is what I wanted to say about second degree relatives. It's a terrible situation, but his mother died when he was, both of his parents died. He was orphaned as a young child. He was raised by other relatives, and he's now considered ineligible to come because his parents aren't in Israel. They both died, and the people that are his family relatives are not considered first degree relatives. They're only second degree relatives. He himself is an artist. He actually, the banner that you see behind him is of Hatikva, and he's the one who did all the calligraphy there. And he's stuck with his hope still back there because the criteria don't allow it. The little girl on the right doesn't need any explanation. Another family in waiting, showing their dedication to Israel. They have not yet been given permission to come. This is the woman who I mentioned, who was literally crying to me when I met her there. This is terrible. This is a heartbreaking picture if you know what you're looking at. This is like the Yisker boards in synagogues throughout the West, where the names of those who have passed away are there. This was hand-woven names of people who have died in waiting. You can see it's all tattered at this point, and they've just given up. They haven't added any names, but there are still these people that are there waiting. This is much more recent distribution of matzah and other Pesach goods that were distributed. But I was showing all of that to get into what's happening at the moment. This was just a couple of weeks ago, barely 2 weeks ago. We were at the airport welcoming the latest group of people who came. You can see they're all with their masks on. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a young man still literally kissing the tarmac upon his arrival. They were all handed roses when they got off the plane. Here he is kneeling down with his knapsack on his back, kissing the ground, being welcomed by our chairman and Penina, the new minister of Aliyah. But I went through all of those to get to this slide in terms of what happens next. So we now have somebody within the government, talk to for sure. The Minister of Aliyah has a good personal, long-lasting, long-term relationship with our chairman, Isaac Bougie Herzog. And we are now trying to arrive at understandings with the government as to what the next steps should be. We're establishing, as I said, we're recommending the establishment of a public committee that will have representatives from the community, from the Jewish Agency, from the government of Israel, rabbis and Kesim, who together will determine what the criteria are that will guide us, guide the state of Israel in absorbing new immigrants from Ethiopia. I mentioned, and I repeat here, there's this commitment to Jewish peoplehood, a connection, Zeri Yisrael, and the principle of family reunification and not family fragmentation, while also avoiding an endless chain of people who would be allowed to come. And that's part of the very difficult part. I mentioned creating this cross-reference, agreed upon list of people who would be able to come. And very importantly, to me, it's an embarrassment that it hasn't happened until now, but since 2013, neither the government nor the Jewish Agency were on the ground in Ethiopia to provide assistance in terms of health and nutrition, Hebrew and Jewish education, professional training, in order both to make their lives a little bit more bearable in Ethiopia and to prepare them for easier absorption here. The food distribution that I showed you for Pesach and the education of the children is all being implemented by this organization called the Struggle to Save Ethiopian Jewry, which is an American-based NGO. The Jewish Agency has helped significantly financially just in the last 2 years, including $160,000 now of emergency aid because of the coronavirus, with providing particularly hygienic equipment and training and so on. We also were able to give another $100,000 through this Struggle to Save Ethiopian Jewry for the nutrition program. I want to mention here as well that the costs of bringing them over to Israel are borne by the Jewish Agency. And of course, it's Keren HaYesod in Australia that raises its funds. and gives it to the Jewish agency that has enabled to do the work that we are doing with them. But there is a decision within the Jewish agency, once we have a sense of what the process is going to be, to renew our activity. I should say it's a policy recommendation at this point, to be more accurate, to renew activity in Ethiopia that would be consistent with whatever plan we're able to come up with the government in terms of who will be brought over and who will not. I'll also mention that there is a sense within the Jewish agency at this point that we bear some responsibility even to those who will not be allowed to come over, who will not be considered eligible. We've kept them in waiting without giving them a no. It's really just been in a stage of waiting all these years. And there's a feeling that we have to provide some sort of assistance to help them, if there are those who will not be considered eligible to come, to get back on their feet in Ethiopia. When I mentioned before about leaving their villages, once they left their villages, they essentially became, well, living in a no person's land, so to speak. They had given up whatever tiny piece of land that they had out in the country, but they weren't registered as residents of Addis or as Gonda. So they're not even allowed to get the kinds of rations that that people who are registered as city dwellers are eligible to.
David, can I just move the conversation to Israel now? Just running a little bit short on time. I just, with waves of mass immigration into Israel, and in fact into any country, there are always difficulties associated with integrating in that first generation. And there's also the issues of, discrimination and prejudice. What do you see as the main challenges faced by the Ethiopian community in integrating into Israeli society?
Probably the biggest obstacle that they face is skin color. I hate to put it in those terms, but there is that's something that no matter how much education they're going to get and how much training they're going to get, that's going to stay with them. And within the community, it's interesting because within the circles that I operate in, there is no discrimination. And people that I circulate with are welcoming the Ethiopians with open arms. But certainly from within the community, and there was the eruption of violence in regard to that just several, I guess a year or so ago at this point, several months ago. I can't deny that there's prejudice within Israeli society. What I can say in that regard, particularly, for instance, within the police force, there's a lot of work going on now, including organizing. There was a trip that was supposed to go over of high-ranking police officers to go to visit Ethiopia and so on. There's a real effort to get the highest echelons of Israeli society and those who are involved with who would be coming into contact with the community, of changing stereotypes and getting rid of prejudice and discrimination. That being said, even without any discrimination based on race or ethnicity, the trip from Ethiopia to Israel takes 3 or 4 hours. But in that 3 or 4 hour flight, you pass by 3 or 4 centuries, if not more, in terms of culture. And to come from a home, still today, the people who are coming, to come from a home with no electricity and running water, to this kind of a modern, technologically driven society, it's just a huge gap. it was Ephraim Kishon who years ago said, Israel is the only country in the world where children teach their mother tongue to their parents. But you have that here where the parents are not adjusting to the society as quickly as the children are. And yet the Ethiopian culture is such, and Rebecca, you can share your experience with this. You probably, I know you have much more firsthand experience with it than I do, where the elders held a position of stature and respect in Ethiopian society that is much higher, I would say, even than in the Western world. And all of a sudden, it was the children who knew what was going on and were able to navigate the Israeli system and so on. And the parents were left behind. So there's a huge breakdown in terms of families functioning as a unit. But Rebecca, really, you're the one with firsthand experience with this. Maybe you can share a bit of what you see happening in that regard.
Well, I would say that, you talk about, the breakdown of that hierarchical structure. And I think something that I have seen, particularly with some of our families in our project in Israel, is that the male in the family, there's often a lot of, because of, they've come to a new country and they're no longer, the head of the household and the head of the head of everything. There's a lot of alcoholism and domestic violence and the breakdown of the family structure, because of the adjustment to to a new society where their roles are different. So I've definitely seen that, yes.
So on the positive side, first of all, I'm thrilled. To me, it's unbelievable that we now have a minister of Ethiopian background and a deputy minister of Ethiopian background. And in many ways, no less significantly, I don't know what you in Australia make of the Eurovision contest that somehow, even though you're in Australia, you've been allowed to participate in. But Israel's entry into the Eurovision that was determined in large measure by public sending in text messages is a amazing young woman of Ethiopian background. Programs like MasterChef and other kinds of reality shows, we've had Ethiopians coming out as the winners. And although these things might seem silly or trivial, to me, it really is a reflection of Israeli society as a whole being welcoming and respectful and appreciative of the contribution that those of Ethiopian origin have. There are also no less than 23 functioning NGOs, almost all of which are run by Ethiopians themselves and grew out of the community, that are working within the community in areas extending from obviously things like education, health, but also even to sports and other such things. And actually now at the Jewish Agency, we're in the process of mapping all of these different organizations, trying to figure out what role the Jewish Agency might have in working with the community here. It's by no means a given that we would get involved. There is a government that is meant to be dealing with the population, but by putting this mapping together, I hope that will be a springboard also for us in working with the government in ensuring that we not only bring them here, but that they become the kind of productive citizens that they've proven they are able to. I think anybody with any familiarity with the community will understand completely that we're not talking about a community that is in any way less equipped in terms of aptitude, intelligence, whatever the criteria would be, to become among the most productive citizens of this society. That it's really a matter of bridging that cultural gap that has existed. That's just a given that we need to overcome.
I totally agree, and I think you know, we've had a lot of successes. Personally, with our own project, for example, from my own personal experience with our project, you know, we've adopted the way we've done this is we've adopted a totally holistic sort of family mentoring based approach, and basically what we focus on is building of personal relationships with a mentor, and with a huge focus on education and developing skills and self-empowerment. And you know, and those kids have then become role models for their own communities as well, and that's had a huge effect. And we've had amazing successes. And as I agree, there is just so much potential in an incredibly beautiful community. Yeah, it's quite exciting. So I've just got a few questions here. I'm just going to have a look. I'll let you keep talking, David. I'll just have a look on my phone. I've got a question from Mark Barr. What is the Ethiopian government's attitude to the emigration to Israel?
They are completely fine with it at this point. There was a period a couple of decades ago, but right now this population, unfortunately, it's not that they're losing the best and the brightest. Well, they might be losing the best and the brightest, but they're not the most economically beneficial at this point because of the horrible conditions they've been living in. They are a burden on society. They are not, so they would not be missed in that regard. And there's full cooperation with the Ethiopian government. Nothing has to be done covertly at this point.
And I have one final question from Ron Hirsch, has asked whether the absorption of Ethiopians in Israeli society has been successful. I think we've sort of touched on that, but do you have anything more you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, the answer is yes and no. It's really yes and no. We can point to so many people, those that I've already mentioned, and ranking officers in the army, and lawyers, and all sorts of, in every field, you can find people of great accomplishment of Ethiopian origin. And at the same time, we have a massive, the poverty level is greater within the community. The education level overall is lower. So we are far from an overwhelming success. But honestly, I'm optimistic. I think that there's, partly because of the demonstrations of a few months ago, partly because of the Knesset members that are now there. I think we're certainly moving in the right direction. A member of the Ethiopian community might shout out now that I'm overstating it, that there's still so much to overcome, and I don't want to deny that. There's huge amounts that have to be invested in the community, but the will, I believe the will is there. And oh, actually, if I say that and I've got Herzl behind me, there's a will, then im tirtzu ein zu agada. And I hope that together with people like you, Rebecca, who have taken this on so personally, and I know I was specifically, I was in touch with people from Keren HaYesod, and I know they have a huge commitment to helping this community as well. And with partners like that, I believe that we really will be making some great progress in the next couple of years.
Well, thank you, David, for a really fascinating discussion this evening. We've all learned a huge amount, and really appreciate you for sharing your knowledge with us tonight. This is a really important issue. It really is an important issue, and we wish you all the best in your advocacy work for the Ethiopian Jewish community left behind. So now I'll hand over to Bren to close tonight's discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Rebecca. David, there was one question that we didn't quite get a chance to, but someone wanted to know a bit more information about Operation Moses, and particularly the fact that 4,000 people died en route to Israel. Are you able to, is there a good source that they might go to in order to
Yeah,
find out a bit more?
seriously, and since so many people are locked in their homes with Netflix, I mentioned that movie, and it really does give an insight into what happened. I met with the person who's portrayed in the movie as the Mossad operative who made it work, and he said he was a consultant for it. It's called the Red Sea Diving Resort. So in terms of an easy way to absorb some of it, I recommend that. And in terms of other sources, I don't have a specific, there's lots that's been written about it, but I would just say, depending on what kind of depth you want to get into, a good Google search will turn up plenty of material.
No worries.
The most painless way to learn about it really is that movie. Then you can check on Google what's true and what's not true in the movie.
Look, I've seen the movie, and it's a great film. I haven't cross-referenced it with Google, but it is a good film. Rebecca, thank you for talking a little bit about your organization at the end there. I'm really glad that you got a chance. For those who are interested, it's called Hod to Success, and you can find it online, hod.org.il. Have a look at it, read a little bit about it. It's a really worthy organization. And I'm just thrilled that Rebecca was able to host tonight and to speak to David. David, thank you so much for your time as well. It really is an important conversation to have. I was quite shocked by the situation that the Jewish community still in Ethiopia faces, and look, more strength to you. I hope solutions can be found. But look, we are over time, so I want to thank you. Thanks to the audience. Thank the two of you, and remember, next week we will be speaking with Moshe Yaalon. Until then, have a great week. Stay healthy, and we'll see you next week.